Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. One of the displays that we've heavily recommended over the last 18 months has been the AOC Q27G40XMN. It's a great low-cost 1440p HDR gaming monitor. Well, today we're looking at its successor, the Q27G40XMN, which ticks many of the same boxes while promising improvements in key areas. Several of this display's main specifications are unchanged from the G3 model. It's still a 27-inch 1440p 180Hz VA LCD panel, but it now comes with 1,152 full-array local dimming zones, up from 336 previously. This should enhance the contrast ratio and reduce blooming to further improve HDR from what was already a pretty solid level in the G3. AOC have also bumped up the backlighting tech in general to now use a quantum dot enhancement layer, which promises a wider color gamut than we've seen before. All of this is achieved while maintaining the same sort of gaming features as before, like adaptive sync. While the Q27G40XMN is a successor to the Q27G3XMN, we're expecting both models to coexist in the market for a while, with the newer G40 model available as a slightly more premium offering. It's priced at $300 US over at Best Buy, while the G3 has typically been going for around $260 to $280 US for the last year. Is it worth a $20 to $40 premium to get more dimming zones? Well, we're certainly going to find out today. We're also expecting broader availability for the G40, given that unlike its predecessor, it's actually available day one in Australia. Today's video is brought to you by the Ugreen Nexode 500-watt desktop charger. I love Ugreen chargers. I've got them everywhere. I rely on them around the office and at home. Their latest product is the world's first 500-watt charging station. Up to 240 watts out of a single USB-C port on the top, a further 4 100-watt USB-C ports, and a USB-A for a total simultaneous power output of 500 watts. Powers 6 devices at once thanks to upgraded GaN Infinity chips, broad protocol compatibility, and 11 levels of safety protection. With a huge output capacity, you can fast charge 5 laptops at the same time, charge a 16-inch MacBook Pro to 60% in 30 minutes, and simplify your charging setup into a single unit. Check the links below to learn more about the Ugreen Nexode 500-watt fast charging station and grab one for yourself today. As usual, I'm starting with the design, and this is one area that's actually been downgraded compared to the G3 model. The Q27G3XMN came with a decent height-adjustable stand that provided typical ergonomics, but the Q27G40XMN omits this for a terrible fixed-height stand with only support for tilt adjustment. This means if you want to use the display at anything other than the very low height it comes with out of the box, you'll have to buy a separate VESA mount or stack up a bunch of books. I think that only ultra-budget monitors should have a fixed stand, and at a $300 price point, the expectation would be some level of height adjustability, so this downgrade is a huge disappointment. The actual build quality of the monitor is okay, though the outer surfaces are largely made from a basic black plastic on the cheaper end of the scale, so it doesn't have a premium look. The rear is quite simple with some geometric sculpting and a red ring highlight, while the front has standard sized bezels and a large chin along the bottom edge. The stand pillar is extremely basic, and the base is a flat, plastic coated, relatively small hexagonal shape. To make matters worse, the fixed height stand is quite wobbly, and this gets annoying when using the OSD. The port selection has also been downgraded compared to the previous model. We're now getting just one HDMI 2.0 port and one DisplayPort 1.2 port with no USB ports. So one HDMI port has been removed, and the DisplayPort connector has been downgraded from DP 1.4 to just DP 1.2. This is despite being advertised as DisplayPort 1.4 on AOC's website. As far as we can tell, it actually uses HBR2 bandwidth instead of the HBR3 used with DisplayPort 1.4. I asked AOC about this, and they said that according to the VESA standard, if a monitor supports HDR and HBR2, it can be labeled as DisplayPort 1.4. All that's required for a DP 1.4 certificate is supporting one of the features included in DisplayPort 1.4, such as HDR metadata transport or DSC. Supporting the newer HBR3 bandwidth spec is not required, so a monitor that only uses DP 1.2 class HBR2 bandwidth can be labeled as DP 1.4 under the VESA standard, provided it supports other features. This is a very technical compliance sort of explanation. that effectively amounts to a loophole. In my opinion, this labeling is misleading to consumers and VESA should not allow it, and even if VESA do allow it, the manufacturer, in this case AOC, should opt to label their monitor DisplayPort 1.2 anyway, as it's more correct in terms of describing the capabilities of the port. But this isn't entirely on AOC, it's also on VESA, who ultimately decide what can and can't be labeled DisplayPort 1.4. The drop to DisplayPort 1.2 does have some performance implications. 8-bit 180Hz is now the maximum that is supported instead of 10-bit on the older model, and this is a very tight support of 8-bit that appears to rely on special timings. The panel itself is 8-bit, so omitting 10-bit signal support isn't a huge deal visually, but it's also less than ideal given its predecessor did support it. Also, the HDMI 2.0 port remains limited to just 144Hz when really it should be HDMI 2.1 to allow for the full 180Hz. I've seen some reports that because the Q27G40XMN uses DisplayPort 1.2 and only just manages to support 8-bit 180Hz at 1440p, some users have had trouble enabling 180Hz on an NVIDIA GeForce GPU without also enabling 422 chroma subsampling. This was something Ratings reported in their review. They had to drop down to 170Hz to maintain full RGB color. However, I didn't have this issue personally on the GeForce GPUs I tested and was able to use the monitor at 8-bit 180Hz on both NVIDIA and AMD cards with full RGB color. I'll talk more about some possible reasons for the discrepancy later in the review. The OSD is unfortunately not controlled through a directional toggle, with AOC instead continuing to use face buttons along the bottom right edge, which makes the on-screen display difficult to navigate, compounded by the wobbly stand. There's a typical range of features in here, the usual color controls and modes, plus some gaming specific stuff like crosshairs, shadow boosting, an FPS counter, and a sniper mode. Firmware updates are not supported as the monitor does not have any USB ports. The display uses a standard matte screen coating, which is typical of most gaming LCDs. The coating has a light grain, which is barely visible on uniform colors, and reflection handling is standard, diffusing direct reflections to make them less defined at the expense of some haze. The Q27G40XMN uses a V8 LCD panel, and response time performance has never been a strong suit of V8 LCDs, so let's see how it performs across the 4 included overdrive settings. The normal mode is the lowest and default setting, which appears to show overdrive off, exposing moderately slow native panel performance. With low refresh compliance, this is not the optimal configuration. Fast improves performance to a 9.45 millisecond average response, and cumulative deviation is now okay. But when we move to the faster mode, this is where we see optimal performance. An average response time of 7.32 milliseconds allows for refresh rate compliance of 60%, which is okay and suitable for a 180Hz refresh rate. Cumulative deviation of around 500 is also pretty good given the LCD technology being used here. However, you will see quite slow transitions for some of the darker range, particularly anything that starts from full black, which confirms that there is some level of dark smearing occurring here. This is still present even in the fastest mode, which pushes the panel too far and leads to obvious inverse ghosting. The faster mode is pretty good across the refresh rate range. Performance only becomes slightly slower as we move down the range, and at 120Hz results are still decent. At even lower refresh rates, performance continues to get slower, but overshoot never becomes overly problematic, so gaming at 60Hz in this mode holds up well. Dropping to a lower mode like fast just makes the monitor slower and isn't something I'd recommend. Based on this, I would say the Q27G40XMN has a single overdrive mode experience. Compared to other monitors at their maximum refresh rate, the Q27G40XMN is neither fast nor slow, sitting somewhere in the middle of that range for LCDs. The best of today's 1440p IPS panels around this refresh rate produce an average greater grey response time of 4.5 to 5 milliseconds, such as the LG 27G-P850 and Asus XG27 ACS. This new AOC model achieves just 7.32 milliseconds at a similar level of overshoot, so obviously quite a bit slower. At the same time, it's not that different to a Dell G2724D that uses an IPS LCD panel. Compared to the previous G3 model, the new G40 is slower at 180Hz but also produces less overshoot, so it's not as aggressively tuned. On average, across the refresh rate range, the G40 sits closer to the bottom of the group. However, it slightly outperforms the G3 in my testing with a better balance across all transitions, whereas the G3 has a bunch of really slow transitions and a bunch of really fast transitions. Again, it's not that different to what we're seeing from the Dell G2724D or even the Gigabyte M27QP that use IPS LCD panels, but it's no match for an Asus XG27ACS or even something like the Xiaomi G Pro 27i, which is also a mini LED LCD but with IPS technology. Dark level performance has improved with the G40 model relative to the G3, which more firmly embeds the display among IPS LCDs in this chart. This doesn't mean the G40 is completely free of dark smearing, but across the refresh rate range, there are less transitions affected by smearing compared to the G3, which reduces how visible this issue is while gaming. So that's a positive step for this VA LCD panel. In cumulative deviation, on average, the Q27G40XMN is slightly better than the Q27G3XMN. We're talking about a 12% improvement. In this metric, the AOC model isn't that different to the G Pro 27i, which tells us the general motion experience from these two panels is quite similar. With that said, the top IPS LCDs in this class have an average deviation of 500, which in the best cases is around 20% better than what this AOC model provides. As far as VA LCDs go though, this is definitely one of the better tuned models, offering a 20% improvement over the Acer XV275UP3 and a huge 62% improvement over the poorly tuned GP2711. The G40XMN is fine for gaming at a 120Hz refresh rate. Again, it's not the best LCD available in this price range, but it's sufficient for medium refresh rate gaming. 60Hz performance, again, you guessed it, very much in that middle to lower part of the range, which is fine enough from a motion standpoint. The Blurbuster's UFO test results give us a better visual understanding of these numbers. Here you can clearly see the G40 has less dark smearing than the G3, though there is still some smearing and some mild inverse ghosting artifacts on the new model. Compared to the IPS LCD Xiaomi G Pro 27i, the new AOC model doesn't look that different. The AOC has a few more artifacts trailing the UFO, but within the UFO, I would say the AOC model is clearer than the Xiaomi. This is honestly a great sign from a VA LCD panel, and the results are much better than we've seen from some VAs previously. Input latency is quite similar to the previous model, with around 1 millisecond of processing delay in the SDR mode with local dimming disabled. Response time figures for the G40 push out the total result compared to the G3. This sort of combination of response times and refresh rate doesn't make the G40 as responsive as higher refresh rate 1440p models, but for typical gaming, it's perfectly fine. Input latency in the HDR mode, though, is a bit of a different story. LCDs have to run backlight zone algorithms, which increase lag compared to OLEDs and LCDs without proper local dimming. This pushes up the Q27G40XMN's processing lag to nearly 10 milliseconds, though this isn't that different to other LCDs. In a positive sign for the new model, HDR processing lag is actually a lot lower than the Q27G3XMN, suggesting some optimization has been done there. Power consumption is another area that is improved going from the G3 to the G40. This new panel is more efficient, consuming just 26 watts, displaying a full white 200 nit image. That's 10 watts lower than its predecessor and allows this monitor to sit alongside most other IPS LCDs. In real-world gaming scenarios, the G40 typically uses slightly less power than OLEDs. The Q27G40XMN is a very wide color gamut monitor thanks to the upgrade to a quantum dot mini LED backlight. This panel achieves 97% coverage of DCI-P3, 97% coverage of Adobe RGB, both of which are higher than the Q27G3XMN, along with huge 84.4% coverage of Rec 2020. This puts the monitor right up in the top portion of this chart, along with other quantum dot enhanced LCDs, and slightly above most QD OLEDs. Crucially, it's a much wider gamut than the older G3 model, which hits 75.2% coverage, increasing the colors that can be shown in HDR. Out of the box, this monitor has average calibration, my unit shipped with decent 2.2 gamma, and a slight blue tint, leading to a Delta E ITP average of 7.5. With such a wide color gamut, it's no surprise to see oversaturation in the color tests by default, with sRGB SDR colors expanded up to fill the gamut. This is especially noticeable in skin tones, which are shifted red and can look a bit sunburned. Compared to other displays, this is a mid-table monitor in factory calibration. Unfortunately, it's not as well calibrated as the original AOC model out of the box, a combination of more significant oversaturation and worse grayscale performance. There are a couple of ways to improve performance in the SDR mode. Windows Auto Color Management enables OS level gamut emulation, and this significantly reduces oversaturation, so colors now look pretty good. AOC correctly reports color primaries for the most part, which allows for a decent, largely accurate experience. However, this mode does not fix grayscale performance. The sRGB mode is also an option, although it heavily restricts settings, so you can't adjust white balance, whereas using ACM still allows for some setting adjustments. The sRGB mode, for some reason, switches the color temperature from being slightly too blue to being too red, which is disappointing. Color results are better than the default mode, but not that different to using Windows ACM. sRGB mode comparisons show the G40 model is again a downgrade from the G3 model and sits towards the lower part of the chart in grayscale. It does, however, outperform competitors like the G Pro 27i. Color checker performance is average and doesn't change the story compared to what we saw in grayscale. The older model was better calibrated in the SDR mode. As an LCD, this panel is quite easy to calibrate, and doing so leads to very good results. I use CalMan for this, and with such a wide color gamut, it's likely you'll be able to use the G40 for a range of work and play. SDR brightness is good, achieving 471 nits peak with local dimming disabled. This is about 10% lower than the G3 model, which isn't significant. Peak brightness can be increased in the SDR mode by enabling local dimming, though I wouldn't advise doing this as local dimming can be distracting in applications with uniform colors. Minimum brightness is good at 39 nits. The native contrast ratio of this VA LCD panel is strong at 4,572 to 1, putting it alongside other VAs that we've recently tested. This gives it decent, deep black levels for an LCD. The contrast ratio is much higher than IPS LCDs, the best of which are in that 1500 to 1 range, usually more like 1000 to 1. This VA is at least 3 times higher, which has benefits in both the SDR and HDR modes. The G40XMN's viewing angles are poor by modern standards, though largely unchanged compared to the Q27G40XMN. VA LCDs simply do not have very good viewing angles, leading to the image quickly washing out when viewing at off-normal horizontal and vertical angles. It's not as bad as a TN panel, but you definitely need to view this display dead-on for the best experience, and you need to ensure the panel is in the proper ergonomic position to get the most out of it. This is where, again, the lack of a height-adjustable stand comes to bite. If you need a panel with better viewing angles, something like an IPS LCD will be much more suitable. Uniformity is good, aside from some fall-off along the left edge of my unit, as well as a slight vignette around the edges of the screen in general. The main central part of the monitor is quite uniform, and this leads to a good gaming experience. Mini LED LCD with full array local dimming is a good technology for HDR, as it has the capacity to enhance contrast and brightness above what a typical SDR LCD is capable of. It's not as immediately well suited for HDR as OLED, as zoned LCDs require more extensive tuning, but if the hardware capabilities and firmware tuning come together nicely, these mini LED panels can produce outstanding HDR. The level of contrast and control that a mini LED panel can achieve is directly linked to its native contrast ratio and amount of dimming zones. In the case of the Q27G40XMN, we're looking at a 1152 zone backlight, meaning each zone is responsible for about 3200 pixels, which is a decent number of zones. This is further enhanced by a high native contrast ratio of nearly 4600 to 1, which helps to reduce blooming within those zones. Typically, VA LCDs do not need as many zones as IPS LCDs to get a similar HDR experience, and when a VA and IPS have the same number of zones, the VA is capable of tighter control and better dimming. The combination of contrast and zones this AOC monitor provides is excellent. In most situations, the G40 is capable of outstanding control, utilizing its backlight zones to show bright highlights and dark shadows on screen at the same time. The zones are small enough that tight control is available around most elements, so blooming isn't often a concern. In fact, I rarely saw blooming artifacts on this panel at all. You also won't see large sections of the image destroyed by an elevated backlight and raised blacks, like you get with edge-lit panels. Most HDR content on this screen looks great. The increased zone count compared to the Q27G40XMN is noticeable and takes this display from being an entry-level HDR experience to something better, at the very least mid-range if not higher. The upgrade from 336 zones to 1152 zones, more than 3x the zone count, allows for noticeably tighter dimming, so in tricky situations where a bit of blooming was visible on the G3, it's much less likely to occur on the G40. The higher zone count also reduces zone flicker in gaming, a phenomenon that occurs when a bright object quickly moves across the screen, visibly activating and deactivating the backlight zones as it moves. With smaller zones and simply more of them, these zone transitions in motion are smoother and less distracting. However, there are the usual pain points for zoned LCD relative to OLED, particularly with small bright elements. Zoned LCDs usually handle this in one of two ways. Either the small element is shown at full brightness, with blooming around that element, or the small element is dimmed to minimize blooming. The Q27G40XMN tries to take a balanced approach, so you can see both issues at different times, but it typically errs on the side of dimming to minimize blooming. OLEDs have much greater control, so can show those dark, high contrast scenes more accurately without compromises. The benefit to getting an LCD though is brightness in brighter scenes. Compared to an OLED, most mini LED LCDs are significantly brighter, especially for higher APL/brighter scenes. Panel dimming and automatic brightness limiters are much less aggressive on an LCD, so the difference between full screen brightness and small window brightness is smaller. If you want the punch of extreme brightness and prefer this aspect of HDR instead of, say, perfect contrast control, then LCDs are easily the better choice. AOC offer a range of different HDR configurations through both the HDR mode and local dimming settings. However, there is only one configuration that's actually worth using, the HDR mode set to display HDR and local dimming set to strong. This configuration has reasonably good EOTF accuracy, whereas every other setting is far too dim in the mid part of the EOTF curve. This includes keeping the HDR mode on display HDR and turning local dimming to medium or low. You really just want to keep that setting on strong. Having just one viable HDR configuration isn't too problematic though, because the display HDR mode with strong local dimming is fantastic. Across all of our usual tests, we get excellent EOTF tracking accuracy, and this applies in both darker, lower APL tests and brighter, higher APL tests. A small amount of over-brightening occurs in some bright scenes, but generally results are good, and even dark level tracking is great, a common issue with LCDs. What all of this means is that in most scenes, the G40 is capable of producing the correct level of brightness the content requests. Color performance in the HDR mode is also pretty good, though white balance does vary a bit, with high levels of brightness output often having a red tint. It's not a massive red tint, and midtones are generally quite accurate. This configuration is more accurate than the HDR mode on the G3XMN, and much more accurate than the best configuration on the Xiaomi G Pro 27i. HDR brightness is excellent, reaching 1387 nits full screen white, 1245 nits at a 10% window, and 953 nits at a 2% window. The 2% results are nothing amazing compared to OLEDs, very competitive with them, but still at the upper end of the LCD scale, while the larger window results are fantastic, outperforming OLEDs by a huge margin. Often the AOC is one of the brightest LCDs you can get. Looking at brightness versus window size, the two AOC models produce essentially identical behavior. There's a small difference for small window sizes, but practically no difference for larger windows. This continues to maintain AOC's brightness lead over the popular G Pro 27i, which uses IPS LCD tech. In real scene brightness, the Q27G40XMN is excellent. Panel dimming is reduced compared to the G3 model and other LCDs, and brightness in most scenes is higher as well. On average, this meant the G40 model was 18% brighter than the G3 model in our testing, though the improvement ranges anywhere from no real uplift to more than 40% higher brightness. The AOC is also comprehensively brighter than other LCD models from Xiaomi and Cooler Master, and defeats OLEDs in the majority of scenarios, outside of very small bright elements. Contrast results are also excellent. In the best cases, this panel can produce contrast in excess of 1 million to 1 when bright and pitch black areas are far apart. In more worst case scenarios where bright and dark objects are close together, local contrast reaches 18,000 to 1, more than twice as high as the G3 model and in line with the Odyssey Neo G7, which has a 1196 zone backlight. This chart also shows the benefit of pairing a 1152 zone backlight with VA LCD tech. The same zone count in an IPS LCD, the G Pro 27i, reached just 4,780 to 1. The AOC's VA LCD has 3.2 times the native contrast and 3.7 times the local contrast in this test. Checkerboard contrast results are also very impressive. The Q27G40XMN is the best LCD we've tested in this area, outperforming the Neo G7 and the other 1440p displays. There is no doubting this combination of panel and backlight is capable of excellent performance. HDR calibration is also very good. This display absolutely destroys the G Pro 27i and is also much better calibrated than its predecessor in both HDR grayscale and color match. Tighter EOTF tracking and better color temperature help out significantly in these results. Color volume is larger as well thanks to a wider color gamut, 7% higher than the G3 model and in line with QD OLEDs. Now there's something that we need to talk about as well in this review, which is the existence of multiple versions of the Q27G40XMN in the wild. As I was completing this review, I wanted to double check a couple of results with Ratings, who do good quality testing as well. I noticed that their review mentioned several bugs and issues. There was the NVIDIA GPU 8-bit 180Hz issue I mentioned earlier, in addition to problems with the strong local dimming setting. They were reporting, and even showed video of, the strong mode causing overbrightening and desaturation which persisted when switching back to the SDR mode, as well as a couple of other concerns. This was strange because I wasn't seeing any of these problems with my G40XMN. 8-bit 180Hz works just fine for me, though the monitor is still DisplayPort 1.2, and I couldn't replicate any of the strong local dimming bugs that they showed. I even followed their videos step by step and saw no desaturation problems that persisted into the SDR mode. The strong local dimming setting looks normal on my unit. I reached out to Ratings to compare a few notes, and we came to the conclusion that there is likely an actual difference between our models and how they operate. The product label on the back of our units look different, and of most interest, my unit had a manufacturing date of March 2025, whereas the Ratings unit was manufactured in February 2025. There's a couple of possible explanations for the discrepancies in performance and why my unit is better, quote unquote, with fewer bugs. One is that there are different regional models, my unit being from the Asia region and Ratings unit being a North American model. Another explanation is that my unit was manufactured at a later date and so contains newer firmware. Given other results, I don't think the physical hardware is different. Panel performance looks basically the same. So in either scenario, I think we're talking about a firmware discrepancy. Either different firmware is used in different regions, or the firmware has been updated in a newer manufacturing run. For what it's worth, the OSD layout looks the same on both units. Not sure whether that makes any difference. Now, the Q27G40XMN doesn't support firmware updates, and there is no firmware readout in the OSD, so it's difficult to check whether there is actually a firmware difference, and if so, update the models to the latest firmware to recompare. This is something that will require further investigation to figure out what's actually going on, and I hope it's something as simple as more recently manufactured models have firmware with some bug fixes applied. This would mean over time, most buyers would receive the newer and better version, but again, we don't know that for sure. What's annoying is that it seems like A, AOC have shipped out at least some units with buggy firmware, and B, you can't update the firmware because this display lacks the capability to do so. This means there's a chance that if you buy a Q27G40XMN, you'll get a unit that performs more like the Ratings model with bugs. This could have easily been solved had firmware updates been supported, and is why we strongly recommend all monitors allow user-side updates. If you do receive a buggy model, I would recommend reaching out to AOC support and returning the display. You should only accept a model that performs like what I'm showing in my review, and certainly the results I'm showing should be possible on this hardware. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. AOC are a bit overzealous with some of their claims in the spec sheet. For example, they get the DisplayPort spec wrong. It's DP 1.2 instead of DP 1.4. P3 gamut coverage is overstated, and as usual, response times are not accurate. In the feature support matrix, you can see the more basic nature of this display. No height adjustable stand, no directional toggle, no USB hub, no KVM switch, no USB-C, no backlight strobing, and so on. However, in good news, the G40XMN does fare better in my pixel inversion test than the previous G3 XMN model. Previously, I saw faint scan lines. On the newer model, these are no longer visible, so it's a pass. Flickering also seems improved relative to the previous model, but can still occur during high frame rate fluctuations. I've left no other firmware issues as a borderline result due to the existence of other models with reported bugs. On a more positive note, this display succeeds in areas other mini LED LCDs haven't, such as in graceful SDR HDR switching, being able to use all features simultaneously, and delivering decent HDR EOTF tracking. Dark smearing is also minimal compared to other VAs. Overall, I'm largely happy with the AOC Q27G40XMN and the upgrades it brings over the Q27G3XMN. Not everything is a step forward with this display, there are some regressions, but in key areas to performance, the new G40XMN model is better. For gamers, after a more affordable, true HDR gaming monitor, this is certainly one of the better products that I've tested. The biggest upgrade is the inclusion of a 1152 zone mini LED backlight to pair with its VA LCD panel. This new backlight doesn't significantly change brightness output, but it does allow for tighter dimming with less blooming, leading to overall better image quality in HDR scenes. Zone flicker and transitions while gaming are much less noticeable thanks to the increased zone count, and the resulting real-world contrast is as high as we've tested from an LCD. On top of this, AOC have improved HDR accuracy and reduced HDR input lag with local dimming enabled. Motion performance has been tweaked a little as well to further improve dark smearing issues and give it a small speed boost relative to its predecessor. We're still not talking about an overly fast monitor, and the 180Hz refresh rate is unchanged, but response time speed is now competitive with entry-level IPS LCDs, and we're well beyond the days of extreme smear trails in dark scenes. As this is a monitor you'd primarily buy for single-player HDR gaming, I think the motion experience it offers is perfectly fine. With reduced levels of flickering and pixel inversion now seemingly solved, I think the panel being used here in general is higher quality than what we've got before. Not every area to performance is improved, the contrast ratio is very similar, viewing angles are still poor, and SDR accuracy isn't quite as good on the new model, but the overall package I think is superior. There are some disappointing regressions though. It seems that to hit a certain price point, AOC have stripped away every remaining non-essential aspect to this product. The stand is the biggest victim, height adjustment is gone, and the new fixed stand is crap. The port selection is even leaner now, and for some reason the display ports are downgraded to DP 1.2 spec. Another issue is the seeming variance in Q27G40XMN units. Ratings Review mentioned several bugs that my unit, manufactured at a later date, doesn't have. With no ability to update this monitor's firmware, this creates a potential lottery when you go to buy one. Are you going to get a good model that works well? I hope so. But unfortunately, I can't guarantee that what I've shown in this review applies to all models. Based on all of this, would I recommend the Q27G40XMN? Well, it's a tentative yes until I get a clearer understanding of the unit variance issue. As I've tested it, this is a great monitor with excellent performance in a market where a lot of other lower cost mini LED LCDs have failed to impress. But if buyers have to keep returning models to get one with the latest firmware, that's not an ideal experience, and once again, it would have been solved had the product supported updates. At $300 US, the new G40XMN model is a little bit more than the G3XMN we've recommended previously. You're looking at having to spend 5 to 15% more on the new model. I think that's worth it for a monitor that is generally better. Just be aware of the areas where this new model isn't as good and plan ahead if, for example, you need a better stand. Across the entire mainstream monitor market, I think $300 US is a great price. Naturally, it's a fair bit more expensive than today's basic 1440p displays without true HDR support, and I think that difference, about $100 or so, is fair. I'm yet to come across a product that performs as well in this price range from another brand. The Xiaomi G Pro 27i, for example, has been a popular choice in some regions. In the US, it costs $370, and in my opinion is a worse product than the Q27G40XMN. So I would absolutely buy the AOC model at a cheaper price. So I think AOC is onto a winner here, but I'll have to continue investigating what's going on with unit variants so that hopefully in the future there won't be any sort of panel lottery or unit lottery on this one. So anyway, that's it for this lengthy review of this new AOC Mini LED affordable 1440p HDR gaming monitor. As I've been talking about for many years now, I'm on the hunt, as always, for mini LED LCD gaming monitors that are worth recommending to people in these sorts of price classes, alternatives to OLED, better low-cost options, and AOC seems to be the brand that is delivering at least the most of any of the brands that we've tested. So we're going to continue testing these products throughout 2025, hopefully find a few more additional options as well. If you want to support our independent testing here at Monitors Unboxed, please consider supporting us via our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits. We've got monthly live streams, we've got behind the scenes content, we've also got the ICC profiles and calibrated settings for all of the monitors that we test. We've got a Discord chat, great place to talk about monitors, get recommendations and advice. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.